entitled States in Waiting, which deals with how nationalisms that did not achieve statehood during post-war decolonization then sought out informal sources of international recognition. Then to my left, I have Richard Drayton, who's Rhodes, of all professors, at King's College.
The title's changed.
The title's changed now, right? So we still have it in the program. Please delete it.
So it's just Professor of Imperial and Global History.
Professor of Imperial and Global History at King's College. Originally from Guyana, as he told us yesterday in his rendition of the national anthem. And has a long and distinguished career in various universities, including Harvard and Yale, where he did his PhD, and is also a scholar of decolonization. And finally, joining us online is Fred Cooper, who's professor of history at New York University. He barely needs introduction. He's the author of many books that deal with exactly the questions that this roundtable is concerned with. I only mentioned three, perhaps one of the best known, Colonialism in Question, Theory, Knowledge, History, in a collection of essays. Then, together with Jane Burbank, Empires in World History, Power and the Politics of Difference. And finally, Citizenship Between Empire and Nation, Remaking France and French Africa, which deals with decolonization in French West Africa. So, as we did yesterday with the roundtables, I prepared a series of questions that I hope can, for the first 45 minutes, structure our discussion a little bit before we open it to the floor. So let me jump straight into this first question and then give the floor to all of our three panelists to have a brief round of answers to this first question. So I thought before disagreeing, we should maybe try to agree on the state of the field and where we are at. And so the first question I wanted to put to you was that, in my impression, there was long a consensus in the historiography that anti-colonialism was always a form of nationalism, and anti-colonialism and anti-colonial nationalism were actually two terms that were almost equated or used interchangeably by historians. And this consensus, that's my feeling, has broken apart, in part owing to scholarship such as Frederick Cooper's, which intends to show that there were forms of anti-colonialism that were not necessarily nationalist. So my first question is whether we can agree on this depiction of where we are. And then the follow-up question to this would be, is what these recent changes have really changed in our understanding or definition of nationalism? Or is this just a historiography that is simply not primarily interested in nationalism, but in things other than nationalism, right? So how has this impacted our definitions and understandings of nationalism, if at all? Are we really talking about the same thing when we say nationalism here? So let's begin maybe again with Lydia, and then I move over to Richard, and here, Fred, and here.
I thought we were going to have the tyranny of alphabetical order, but I'll start. We can reverse it.
All right.
So I'll begin.
Okay.
So, Michael, in how you framed the initial question, you began with whether sort of even almost a first phase of historiography on these questions, which was whether independence was achieved in Lagos or granted in London. And I wanted to begin there because I think here we have sort of an implicit value judgment on independence. One is a sort of personal, perhaps moral achievement that's happening in the former colony, and the other is an external form of recognition that's coming from the former metropole and also eventually an international community, for which independence means formally joining as a recognized nation state. So And one of the things I try to do in my work is to think about what is sort of involved in this construction of independence as a moral question, rather than one that we all know of, which is a question of power dynamics. And who has an investment in casting it in these moral and even, dare I say, civilizational terms as something that can be achieved through readiness. And so there was that kind of earlier literature, and that's something that I'm definitely trying to break out of, but also think about that kind of sort of slippage between national self-determination in that language of achievement versus international recognition, which is coming from the outside, and how nationalists themselves are very aware of those two things and are moving back and forth between where they're deriving, where they're situating their claims. And then, as Michael was characterizing, we've had this kind of debate with which Fred and Richard have been participating in print for several years now on the importance of the nation state as kind of the end point of decolonization. And where I see what's really important about this debate and these ideas and projects and actualizations, though often short-lived, of federation, where I see is really important is how this opens up possibilities for us to write within. So with these sort of federation discourses, yes, we have, the United Arab Republic, Central African Federation, Caribbean, they break down, but they really show the contingency of decolonization and how people at the time are maneuvering through it and seeing all sorts of possibilities for them. But I don't believe that nationalists themselves really saw them in contradiction. Some, and Fred, you're probably about to disagree with me, but some may have preferred to be embedded in a federal system, but they also were maneuvering through an international system that was becoming more and more sovereigntist in the unit in which it recognized. And the tensions between the two, the tensions between these possibilities and short-lived actualizations versus the limitations that were imposed and how individuals and groups were maneuvering through them is something I find very fascinating. The Federalist discourses and how nationalists themselves are using them, sometimes they're doing it in form of alliance politics. So it's not even really in terms of an actual federation they're trying to achieve. Jacob Kunangwa, a SWAPO, the dominant Namibian nationalist movement, one of his petitions for the UN, he's proposing to federate with Angola, which at this time was still a Portuguese colony. This is the early 1960s. Simultaneously, Moise Tshombe of the secessionist Congolese province of Katanga is proposing a federated Copperbelt state with white-ruled southern Rhodesia, and this is even before the breakup of the Central African Federation. So the nationalists themselves they're making these proposals as demonstrations of affinity, and they're also maneuvering through a landscape that is changing quite rapidly. And there are lots of plans for federations that never come to be. In South Asia, there are many narratives, conflicting narratives about the Simon Commission, which in Indian nationalist historiography is severely demonized as an attempt to justify a colonial rule through casting India as a collection of irreconcilable groups that weren't ready to govern themselves. However, Nagas in Northeast India petitioned the Simon Commission to recognize themselves as a polity within British India, and eventually, when British India will dissolve. That sense is even there in the Simon Commission. And Ambedkar is also petitioning the Simon Commission for protection for Dalits. The Cripps Plan of 1942 was an attempt by the British Empire to sort of head off independence, even that late in the game, in order to to grant a full dominion status to India. And one of the many aspects of that plan was for a collection of hill states modeled off of the British South African protectorates. Now, Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland became independent in 1966. So you can imagine if there were a northeast set of protectorates, that may have led to a very different political organization there. So, and those plans are very well known in the regions themselves. So, and they do shape nationalist aspirations moving forward. So for me and in my work, it's not necessarily whether these plans came to fruition, but how they articulate a set of different kinds of containers for the aspiration of the nationalist claim.
All right, thank you, Lydia. I'll pass on to Richard. Do you have a mic? Okay.
I think that I would map the historiographical landscape a bit differently from the terms that you proposed. Already by the last 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, the field of anti-colonial nationalism had been colonized by the concerns of social historians. And the arguments that were being provided in a number of different theatres were attempts to explain the complexity of the phenomenon of anti-colonial nationalism and the variety of different interest groups and perspectives and aims and objectives and interests which were contained within that constellation which retrospectively we construct as anti-colonial nationalism. So I'm just going to journey around the world from region to region. So starting off with the Latin Americanists, you know, you can look at a work like Tulio Dongi's Revolución y Guerra from the early 70s, which looks at the kind of period of the making of state-making in the Southern Cone in Latin America in the early 19th century. And I mean, that's a portrait of the complex variety of interests involved in the making of Argentina as a state. At the same time, you had these new literatures emerging about the role of the porteños as kinds of proxies for various Western interests, analyses emerging about the ways in which the nationalist elites in Latin America operated in a kind of predatory internal colonial way to their own minorities or sometimes majorities, and people focused, for example, on the war against the Mapuche in Chile and the war of the desert in Argentina. So the problem of anti-colonial nationalism, at least in Latin America, had become an address of the ways in which forms of both pre-colonial and post-colonial indigenous elites had a variety of different positions and interests, which were often, in fact, only in temporary alliance with the kind of broad masses of the Latin American people. And of course, there are very specialist literatures for Brazil, with its transition from Portugal and Cuba, which of course has a much later independent struggle. If one was to turn then, moving, I suppose, towards the East, African historians, again, in the late 20th century, were also kind of describing the extraordinary complexity of late colonial African politics. So, if one looks at Jean Ullman's article, "The Young Men and the Porcupine," from the 1980s, 90s. Richard Rathbone's Nkrumah and the Chiefs from 2000. Fred Cooper's extraordinary article, Our Strike, from the 1990s. Lonsdale's The Moral Economy of Mau Mau. quite extraordinary work was being done in terms of asking, what was involved in the politics of nationalism in that moment, and what were the various kinds of splits and divisions which retrospectively can be consumed in a kind of prehistory of the nation, but in fact represented a variety of different perspectives. South Asia, there was this kind of late colonial British-centered so-called Cambridge School, which sought to understand anti-colonial nationalism in terms of attempts by colonial elites not to acquire political independence and their own states, really, although they ended up being forced so to be, according to this account, but rather simply to negotiate better interests, better outcomes for themselves relative to the British colonial state. So that, again, the exit towards independence comes late as a result of the conjuncture of the war and its aftermath. This particular argument then is taken up within India from the left by what became known as the Subaltern School, with a series of criticisms, once again, about the ways in which Indian nationalism as an elite phenomenon existed in a very complicated relationship to the various political interests of other Indian groups. Southeast Asia, Ben Anderson, long before he wrote Imagined Communities, wrote his PhD thesis on the nature of Javanese nationalism and its emergence out of the Second World War, which then informed, again, looking at the kinds of ways in which this phenomenon of nationalism was in fact a far more hybrid and complex thing than a simplistic account would occur. This then comes to inform his role in providing a kind of critical opposition to what happens in Indonesia after the 1966 coup and the famous Cornell file, and he becomes very concerned with human rights abuses in Indonesia. All of this comes to inform that book, which marks the field of the study of nationalism, Imagined Communities in the late 70s, which really begins with his disquiet, with the claims being made by the Indonesian state to speak in terms of the Indonesian nation as a whole, ignoring minorities. Of course, go to the East again. One looks at the kind of James Scott, moral economy of the peasantry, and the ways in which, again, Vietnamese nationalism had been disaggregated into a variety of different interest groups. Now, this continues into, I don't think there's any revolutionary shift. I think this continues into a variety of interesting new work in the 21st century. One can look at the development of the literatures on loyalism with Daniel Branch and what's his name now at Warwick, Kenyan historian David Anderson. Looking at, pardon me? Looking at forms of loyalism and the ways in which you had many actors within the colonial state. This, in a way, is very similar to the kinds of stuff which Allman and Rathbone were doing in terms of looking at the elements of anti-colonial politics within the Ghanaian state that were within the Gold Coast political life that were not investors in the Nkrumah regime and state. The kind of discontented that existed. The body of work which has been foregrounded in your question, which is the work on the role of federations, as in Fred Cooper's extraordinarily important book of 2014, or Gary Wilder's Freedom Time. This is an important kind of set of arguments about how particular elites conceived in a particular historical conjuncture about possible exits from empire in the middle of the 20th century. And I've discussed my disagreements with Fred in a piece in CSAME. I'm not going to rehearse them now, except to the extent that people want to do so in the question time. What I think has been some of the most interesting new developments in the 21st century, which we should address if we want to think about anti-colonial nationalism, is first of all, the new literatures really on violence in the late colonial moment, whether one's looking at David Anderson and Carolyn Elkins' work on Kenya and Mau Mau, or Del Tombe et al. Cameroon, where the kind of revelation of the kind of scale of violence in counterinsurgency in Cameroon in that period. So there's been a whole recovery, and indeed there's a new body of work of recovery on the French colonial violence in Algeria, which has obviously been working side by side. So the whole portrait of the place of nationalism and of forms of insurgency and of this I think has matured as new archives have become available. The other interesting body of work on anti-colonial nationalism has been the work done on its prehistories by people like Leslie James, what's his name now in politics at Queen Mary, who wrote a very interesting kind of critical review of Gary Wilder in the LRB, Musab Yunus. There's also Farida Zaman at Oxford, who've been writing about the ways in which ideas of futures are central to the forms of anti-colonial politics which are emerging in the early 20th century, and which are critical for understanding the political constellations which emerge in the middle of the 20th century in the era of Bandung, in the era of decolonization, and which continue to inform some of the kinds of tensions within the post-colonial state. So that I think that we're dealing here with a very, very complicated field of work, some of which has operated very exclusively within regions, but which has also, in other work, begun to look at interactions across regions. And I'd like to really end by looking at a book like Tim Harper's Underground Asia, which I think is an exemplary work looking at the ways in which anti-colonial nationalism, which previously we paid attention to only in the moment of the 1940s and 50s, has roots that go back to the beginning of the 20th century in forms of South-South and South-North interactions. Of course, Ben Anderson does this a bit in his 2005 book, Under Three Flags. And we're now developing, I think, quite rich global histories of anti-colonial nationalism that look at forms of, use both the approaches of comparative and connective history to make sense of how these constellations of opposition emerged, both within territories and between them, in the mid-colonial moment, as well as in the late colonial moment, in ways which make the whole story of decolonization become much richer and much more complex.
Thank you, Richard. All right, the floor is yours, Fred. I hope you can hear us.
I've heard, yeah, well, and thanks for including me, despite my having to intervene in this disembodied fashion. The questions we're talking about in round one here are really variants on those of rounds 2 and 3, all of which are asking us to think about nationalism in relationship to something else. Asking whether people are really nationalists or not, whether nationalism is a good thing or a bad thing, isn't nearly as helpful as thinking about nationalism relationally. Nationalism is both a mission in itself and a means to other goals. Now, among this group that's speaking this morning, I am the old man. So I've actually, in the course of my career as a student and professor, have witnessed a lot of the shifts that Michael's question was asking us to think about. When I started studying Africa as an undergraduate in the 1960s, I was taught that there were two approaches to nationalism in Africa. One was the quest for an independent sovereign state, what might better be called nation-statism. And the other was nationalism as a more general form of liberation from colonial domination, for economic justice, social equality, dignity, which might entail one form or another of political unity. The first, the nation-statism argument, was very popular among American political scientists. The second was highlighted, for example, in a book by Thomas Hodgkin, the English political scientist, who entitled the book Nationalism in Africa. So he talked a lot about different things, but all folded them all into the rubric of nationalism. What this work was showing is that the period after World War II when the empires of France, Britain, the Netherlands, etc., were very severely weakened, this was an opportunity for the posing of different sorts of demands, which became much more realizable, or at least plausible, than they had been before the war. And some of these struggles for these demands were taking place within empire, others against empire. Now, the point of the Hutch kind of approach to nationalism was to fold all the kinds of opposition movements, be they labor organization, independent churches, urban associations, into a quest into a nationalist rubric. Since then, there have been the kinds of studies that Richard pointed out, in not only in Africa but in other continents, that have emphasized many of these same themes that we saw earlier, but without necessarily folding them into a nationalist teleology. A movement of workers or veterans of the French army, say, might be really a movement about labor and about securing the dignity and pensions that ex-soldiers deserve. And the discourses that these movements drew on might well be one in which an African or Indian identification was posed against imperialist powers, but it also might be based on a Marxist discourse shared through organizational connections to trade unions, and hence a connection to Moscow, but also to Paris or London, as well as to Cairo and Algiers. Now, the problem that we're different perspectives here point to the question that Michael posed yesterday. If we have such an inclusive view of nationalism, what is a nationalist? In a way, rather than directly answering that question, I think the point that we can focus on is taking seriously the different goals that people have and how they were framing them, rather than putting them into a narrative of our own creation. And this applies to the Federalist question in particular. If we're being asked whether federalism was a serious alternative to quest for the independent nation state, this is an empirical question, and it seems to me that the answer to that question is clearly yes. Whether we in 2021 think of federalism as a viable alternative or as a false path, some of the most thoughtful political activists of the times clearly took it seriously. Before 1957 in sub-Saharan French Africa, it is hard to find a political movement of any broad appeal that preferred independence on the territorial division, based on the territorial divisions that existed, to a federation of African territories with some kind of continued relationship to France. The UPC in the Cameroon is the exception to that. The work of Lydia, among others, is showing how important were the alternative frameworks within which people were thinking, not necessarily in contradiction to nationalist thought, but with a complex array of alternatives that for a time appeared open. At least until the debacle in India of partition and the efforts of the Indian National Congress to eliminate alternatives on its territory. In a way, Algeria is the opposite of what I've observed in sub-Saharan French Africa, where the FLN emerged by the early 1950s as a singular movement focused on national independence. But much scholarship is showing that it took a lot of effort, as well as the extreme intransigence of the French state, to bring about such an alternative in the face of the multiple affinities and interests on the part of Algerians, as workers, as Muslims, with connections across North Africa and the Middle East, as veterans of the French army, some of whom were even willing to work for or within that state. Although Frantz Fanon is sometimes read as as a person describing a Manichaean colonialism, he could also be read as a militant trying to eliminate any middle ground between subversion and revolution. An important position precisely because so many people were trying to occupy different sorts of grounds that didn't fit either categorization. Lydia is right in her remarks she just made to talk about how various forms of claim making had to do with an international structure, international districts that, to use her word, were becoming increasingly sovereigntist. And in that sense, some of the new histories, like those that Richard cited, like Tim Harper's, for example, are portraying a range of possibility of different forms of anti-imperialism in the 1920s and 1930s that were quite rich. And one of the questions about thinking about the 1950s and 1960s is the extent to which these positions and ranges of possibilities were narrowed down within the constraining effects of an international system that was becoming increasingly sovereigntist and was constraining the types of varied positions that we've seen being opened up. So I think if one looks at the long-term viewpoints, there's a really serious historiographical issue that we're facing of looking at time that may be in some ways not consistent with the teleologies that we started with when I was an undergraduate, and may in some ways have a chronology that tends in the reverse direction.
All right, thank you, Fred. Let me change tack here a little bit so that we still have enough time for discussion. Also, because I realized that in formulating my first question, I actually conflated my originally first and second question into one. So let me try to put one final question to all of you, allowing to reflect a little bit further on this. First of all, I'm grateful, of course, and surprised also that Richard would mention Latin America, early 19th century Latin America, which I didn't expect to treat here as a case of decolonization. It should be, but it's often not labeled that, right? It's interesting, it seems to me, for one particular reason now, which is that, as you just said, in the writings of people like Alperin and François-Xavier Guerra and others, this notion that Latin American countries became independent nation states, even though there was no nationalism, is actually an older notion than it is in some of these other literatures that we're discussing here. But it seems to me the interesting thing there was that people like Alperin and so forth, they said, no, contrary to what Benedict Anderson says about the Spanish-American Creole pioneers of nationalism, actually these people end up with nation states in their lap without ever having nationalism. Right, so there the thing to say was, this is not an instance of nationalism, and we shouldn't treat it as an instance of nationalism. And now, I guess to reformulate my second question here is, and to pick up something that Fred just said, I mean, those people who are not the ones that you called nation-statists now, and are nonetheless sometimes called nationalists, what's the benefit of calling them nationalists at all, right? I mean, what is it that we are learning in these literatures about the category of nationalism? Listening to you, Richard, it just sounded as so now we know it was more variegated, right, less monolithic and more complex than people perhaps at some point assumed. But this doesn't exactly change our definition and understanding of nationalism, right? So I want to press you a little bit harder on this one. And then following with the final thing, so there's this whole discussion how it comes into the world and you know why people pick it up or not so, on some others not so much. But then there's the other question: why does it stay once its ostensible purpose, the nation state, is achieved, right? And Peter Judson in his HR contribution calls it the inability of nationalism to attain satiety, is that the correct pronunciation? So maybe you could speak to these two things. I mean, more specifically, what definitions of or understandings of nationalism are we dealing here with? Have they changed? And how do you explain to yourselves that this doesn't go away? Let's maybe have a different order. Yeah, Richard, why don't you start?
Well, I mean, you set us on in question one a historiographical question, so that I answered it as such. Sure. I thought it would be helpful to kind of paint this landscape, not to answer the question of the kind of question which you're asking now. I mean, I think Proteus was the son of Poseidon, a water god who was said to be able to tell the future, he was very evasive, though, and if you tried to pin him down, he changed his form. Now, I think that's one of the characteristics of this phenomenon that we call nationalism in all contexts. Anti-colonial nationalism being simply one particular type. And in the case of all nationalisms, anti-colonial and otherwise, we have to remember that they are ideas which are always being mobilized in a variety of different ways for a variety of different interests. And I think because I'm a materialist, I would begin with erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral. And people begin with very practical interests having to do with command over resources, access to particular forms of ontological or resource equality, questions over rights to land, over participation in the state, over benefit from being part of a social state in one, however sophisticated or primitive a form. And that these claims, which are practical political claims about the future, because here I disagree with Bernard, nationalism is not about the past. It may assert a past, but it's always about the future. It's always about constellating a particular group of actors towards a projected common future. And that common future involves a particular claim on interests. And this is why nationalism cannot attain satiety, because the point of nationalism is not the nation state. The nation state is always a means towards a particular end of social living, of living together in collective life and participating in one way or another and protecting one kind of interest or another. So it seems to me that if we bring this set of realist, materialist concerns to the domain of politics, we recognize what is at stake in this shape-shifting Proteus of nationalism. That nationalism, anti-colonial or otherwise, is always about the prosecution of interests in the name of a particular ethno-territorial polity which may or may not have some relationship to a state apparatus. That would be my kind of long response to your question.
It's actually a remarkably short response to two questions, so thank you so much for this. Let's reverse the order and continue with Fred, and then Lydia has the final word.
Okay, so this, I'll fold in my answers to your second and third questions if I understand what our current marching orders correctly, Michael.
You do, yeah. Thanks for.
Okay, so the question that Richard left us with is what is the point of nationalism, and the goal, as he points out, is not the nation state as such, but in a social setting. The question that leads us to is who gets to live together and who doesn't. And here the issues that we're focusing on of different kinds of alternative pathways and the blockages that with them encounter becomes quite germane. Federalists were trying to solve the problem of how to put together people who are located in different places and were not necessarily culturally the same. Now, the Federalist solutions that were proposed in the 1950s failed, but it isn't clear that advocates of the kinds of nation states that came out of this process have solved them either. Federalists had the difficulty of capturing the political imagination of people in a unit that was explicitly heterogeneous, often distant from immediate experience, and of fostering equality among units with different material and human resources. The serious attempts from the West Indies to India and parts of Africa to building federalism did so in the context of imperialist forces that were trying to make this process as difficult as possible. Nation states face the problem that rarely, if ever, do boundaries of subjective belonging conform to boundaries of a state. In post-World War I Europe and post-independence Africa, states were expected to make nations. They sometimes did so. They sometimes produced nationalisms after the fact. But they sometimes did so at enormous cost and bloodshed. Think of the Balkans from the 1920s to the 1990s. There is much evidence that Africa, in many parts of the continent, did in fact come to believe in the integrity of colonial constructed states, even in a place as chaotic as the former Belgian Congo. And in those terms, wish to hold leaders to the task of governing those states in a manner that would reflect something of the goals that Richard just talked about. But it's also clear that ruling classes live both inside and outside the states that they rule, with their Swiss bank accounts and Mediterranean villas, while peasants, pastoralists, and workers might live across poorly defined borders, and African migrants to Europe or North America or elsewhere reproduce both their affinities and their differences among each other, both in their places of residence now and their points of origin. The problem is not cultural difference in itself, but that cultural singularity can serve as a basis for claiming exclusionary power. Yesterday, Nicole referred to Southeast Asian polities as empires dressed up as nation states. And she also referred to imperialism's alchemy that led to a preservation of multi-ethnic, imperially constructed states with authoritarian tendencies within them. The claim of liberation from the West was a force at a certain time, but both it and the battle against racist imperialism has faded as the kind of structure that Nicole described became that which was being defended by political elites. The question is not just one of how different polities govern difference, a question that we talked about a lot in yesterday's afternoon sessions, the question of difference within a polity, but as a question of existing in the world, of trying to form polities with some kind of national basis in a world that's highly unequal. In the 1950s, Leopold Senghor pointed to the contradictions of seeking independence of a world characterized by interdependence. The biggest problem is that capital is highly mobile, workers are mobile but face barriers, discrimination, and dislocation, and states aren't mobile at all. Some scholars have argued that national states have been the best bulwark against the depredations of global capitalism. And in some times and places, there is a strong case to be made for this argument, particularly in Europe after World War II. It never worked very well in Africa, and the danger may have returned to Europe, where the mobility of capital has become an argument for dismantling the welfare state. Decolonization posed a challenge to corporations that had extended their reach under imperialist regimes, but they had the means to meet the challenge, especially their being able to pick and choose where to invest and to demand favorable terms from states competing for their investments. Capitalist countries and corporations based there, France and Netherlands, and in a different way, Japan, did very well for themselves in the era of decolonization. Thinking historically about these questions should be a warning to emphasize both the importance and the difficulty of thinking relationally about different political forms, national or otherwise. Whether they report to embody national sentiment or not, they exist in a world of asymmetrical power relations, ambiguous boundaries, multiple forms of affinity. Senghor thought that thinking about sovereignty in layered terms, recognizing multiple forms of affinity, while looking to a more inclusive level to protect rights and allow for debate and action on a larger scale, would allow people to think dialectically about independence and interdependence. When his schemes for implementing those ideas failed, he became what he had warned about, an autocrat using the bounded exclusivity of the nation state to repress dissent. There is something in this tragic turn of the federal national quandary that might serve as food for thought. And that seems to me the point that Peter was getting at. So let me conclude with a couple of words on question number 3. Peter's point, I think, is valid both in the sense that it has something to do with states that consolidate themselves, but also resistance and attempts at secession from exactly that kind of state. And in regard to the first point, consolidation, for many, as Peter pointed out, the nation isn't national enough for people who regard it as theirs. Since people don't correspond neatly with borders, the discourse of nationalism leads logically to arguments for purity. Those arguments can be countered, and they have been, by defenders of inclusive nationalism. The problem isn't difference per se, but the mapping of difference onto territory and onto claims to power. It should be no surprise that after independence in the 1960s, a number of African states expelled people they labeled as foreigners. This happened in South Africa. Xenophobic violence happened in South Africa after liberation in 1994. For the defender of African nationalism, a continent-wide nationalism, and this is a very important point of view going both before and after World War II. For those defenders, events like these are tragic. They should remind us that advocates of layered sovereignty, as opposed to a unitary sovereignty, at a point that is still worth considering, even if their particular formulations for how to achieve this have fallen on the wayside. The second side of the not being fully satisfied with the national boundaries has to do with what those national identifications are. And the danger that a focus on claiming national status as a means as a form of governance and existence in the world, the danger is that this encourages ever finer claims to national identification. We have examples of this in Africa, in Biafra in 1967, or in the South Sudan, where the independence of the South Sudan from the Sudan quickly gave rise to a civil war between different ethnically, would-be nationally defined factions within the South Sudan. But it's also an issue in Spain, where both Basques and more recently Catalonians have entered into a quest for independence, even within a state that was to a large extent a democratic one, not accepting the Spanish state as such. The problem, once again, isn't the existence of national sentiment per se, nor is it the quest for people to use national identification, national sentiment as an argument for reconstructing a more socially just world. The problem is in the relationship to power. Power as it exists both within political entities and within an unequal world. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Fred, for folding these two questions together. And the last word is Lydia's.
Okay, so one of the things that we determined yesterday is that nationalism is not the same thing as the nation state. And in my own work, I often use the phrase nationalist claims making or nationalist claimant as a way to describe behavior without kind of falling into the discussion about whether someone or a group is legitimately national. And if someone calls themselves a nationalist, makes a nationalist claim, they're a nationalist claimant. And so this is a way of using people's words for themselves. But there's so much complexity going on in this era of decolonization. We've all articulated elements on this panel, thinking of Adom Getachu's wonderful book, World Making After Empire, and this concept of world making. Also, you can have the much more coercive forms of this, and the anthropologist Carol McGranahan uses the term post-imperial formation to refer to the People's Republic of China and also the United States. And she's a Tibetanist, so that's not accidental that she's thinking in these terms. I use the term state in waiting as a way of capturing this sort of continuum between nationalist movement and independent state. And that independence, as we've articulated, was not a flip switch. It was a set of negotiations without a predetermined end, and yet over time, the shape of that end became more and more fixed. And the process of that is one we are all exploring. So how to kind of concretize some of this in a sort of specific people, specific events. And I actually wanted to tell a set of sort of interlinked archive stories about the anthropologist Laura Thompson. So she was born in Hawaii, and she got her PhD from Berkeley in 1937. And immediately after that, she worked for the US Navy in Guam until 1944. She actually advised the Navy on how to retake Guam during the Second World War. And after that, she returned to the United States, and because she routinely petitioned Congress on the behalf of the Chamorro people of Guam, she was never allowed back into Guam until much later in her life. She continued to work for the US government, but on Native American Indian reservations, particularly Navajo and Hopi. And in the early 1950s, she was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to study, in their words, and this is one of the earliest examples of the word indigenous I've found in a US government document, to study indigenous communities in Europe who might destabilize Cold War allies, such as the Basques, Catalans, and Scots. And this funding was actually part of the Point 4 plan of development funding that more usually was applied to the Third World, what we now call the Global South. I came across Thompson because she was teaching at University of North Carolina, and the husband of one of her students was a nephew of the Naga nationalist leader. So this nephew, Vishale Iralu, contacted Thompson and got her involved. And she was doing research at the UN library on sort of sovereignty and claims making and how to get a claim to the UN, having done this before Congress for Chamorros at Guam. And she was desperately trying to reach Raphael Lemkin and to think about this in terms of, to think about the Naga question in terms of, was this a genocide, was it not? What are the sort of international legal constructions that this claim might fit in? And then Lemkin died in August 59, and that meeting never came to be. I'm sort of linking these stories in Thompson's career to sort of place claims like Chamorros, like Native American Indians, like, frankly, Basques, Catalans, and Scots, and Nagas within the same frame because it's part of a similar career. Now, these aren't claims that we normally think of as legitimately national. And at times, the claimants themselves may or may not have been using those words. Many claims today that are made based on indigeneity formally were nationalist claims, because that was a language of power during the era of decolonization. The Naga nationalist leader Ngami Zapufizo referred to sovereignty as a form of written legal magic that would make the international community listen to you. So on this point of satiety, and it really made me think of Ralph Bunche dealing with the Congo crisis and worrying about these sort of, well, if Congo broke apart, here I'm referring to Congo Leopoldville, current Democratic Republic of Congo, would have this Matryoshka doll effect. And he uses that metaphor of too many new small states, balkanization, like all these metaphors are referring to here sort of what's going to happen. Are we going to have another global war like the First and Second World Wars? And this was of deep concern for the international community, the United Nations, during this period of time. But so many of these claims kind of transcend specific eras. So in an interesting inversion, many of the claims that I've worked on now are part of, there's an organization called the Unrepresented Peoples Association, Unrepresented Peoples Organization, UNPO. It's based at The Hague, and it's actually run, he's the general secretary rather than the secretary general, but it's run by Ralph Bunche III, Ralph Bunche's grandson, and one of the Naga groups are members. The Rehoboth Bastards, a mixed-race religious community in Namibia, who've been petitioning first the League of Nations and the United Nations, really from like from the beginning of the League of Nations onwards, practically annually. They are members, and Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, has been a member. So this organization was actually founded at the immediate end of the Cold War. And a number of former Soviet socialist republics actually join UNPO, and they're there for maybe 6 months, maybe a year, and then they get UN membership. So these groups find organizations like this useful because they provide forms of recognition, even when from the outside you may not see them as particularly meaningful. Sort of the biggest activity that UNPO does is it organizes a soccer football tournament for these groups. So I kind of wanted to close with this idea that these claims are here to stay. They take on new names, and they'll use whatever kinds of international apparatus are available to them. And if forums are closed, they will build and join new ones. And it is insatiable. And that's kind of the point. And this sort of fits in with this theme of the political proteus and these protean forms that nationalist claims take and change within over time.
All right, thank you, Lydia. So we have about another half hour for open discussion and questions. First of all, for those of us joining us online, I want to apologize that I didn't look at this, in fact, didn't have this iPad in front of me to feed in questions from people joining us online. You now can. I have it here, and I will pledge to look at it. There's none here. Right, let's begin with Sebastian. Servus.
Yeah, thanks to all three of you. This was a great panel. In many ways, it matches well, I think, with the panel we had yesterday on empire. It's really it's one conversation. And maybe in response to these two panels, I'm asking the following question. I thought both yesterday in the empire panel and now that many of the arguments were just very convincing. The way in which the multiplicity of, aspirations and different goals and so forth feeds into something that we retrospectively call nationalism. But ultimately, we end up in a world of nation states, right? So I guess my question is this: do we need to separate what nationalists and other aspiring people want, wish, call for, desire, on the one hand, and what really happened on the other hand? And to explain the second, the first is maybe not a good place to start. In other words, what really happened maybe has ultimately not that much to do with all these, you know, the aspirations, the desires, the hopes, and so forth. So we probably need to, it seemed to me, radically differentiate between the two. So for example, when yesterday we heard about the way in which many people in the Austrian Empire still had affinities and loyalties to the empire, that's maybe one thing, but that maybe ultimately doesn't explain whether the empire survives or not. Same here with nationalism. So if we, for example, if we think, you know, by way of analogy, let's say Ancien Régime France, and we have just, you know, a year before the revolution, a poll, then we will see all kinds of affinities with the Ancien Régime, and many people thinking in terms of the Ancien Régime and want to preserve it, maybe modify it, and so forth. 1867 Japan. Nobody dreamed of the major restoration. Everyone thought in terms of the, you know, of the shogunate. And they would have preserved it, everyone, even the ones who then were the actors of the major restoration. The Germans in 1989 who flocked to the streets in East Germany, you know, they didn't have, not many of them didn't necessarily have unification in mind. Anyway, what I'm saying is we have all these ideas, aspirations, and so forth, but looking back, it's difficult to imagine that France was today still, you know, ruled by feudal estates and not the rising bourgeoisie in the 19th century. It's difficult to imagine that the shogunate survived industrialization and so forth. So yes, it's important to see the complexity, important to see the different practices, and also I think crucial to understand that when people say empire or nation, and we've learned that today I think very, very well, they mean something different frequently. They have other things in mind. But ultimately, in the and I think here we need to move from. I mean, the focus has been so much on affinities, loyalties, ideas, and so forth, and sort of the material, the more structural context has completely disappeared. So as soon as we insert that, then, as Lydia just said, nationalism is the language of power. It's the form of legal magic that ultimately does the trick. So. Yeah, I guess these are two strands of scholarship almost, and maybe separating the two questions is the solution instead of fighting over whether one or the other was the more viable option.
All right, I'll always put at least 2 questions on your plate before having a round of answers. So I think Cyrus was next. And as the mic moves, right, so I have 5 people on my list here. I have already 2 or 3 questions online, so.
Thank you so much for a really great panel. Just a few notes first and then my question, and I'll crank them out fast. So first, one note. One question I ask myself as you were talking about federation, and that's actually the theme I want to talk about and then also ask you something about, is whether, for instance, in the African context, there were pre-colonial roots to these federational ideas. Maybe empires, African empires, that sort of are at the core. Because I say this because I do think that we tend to think in too much presentist terms about these federations as an immediate 1950s answer to what's going on with basically decolonization. Point number 2, and note number 2, you know, one thing that I still don't have wrapped my head around at all is the question whether it is rather weak national or strong national actors, elites in one region that push for federation more. Because in the Arab context, and that's the one that I know best, it is both, but for different reasons. I find this really, really interesting. I don't know how this works in other regional sort of, you know, constellations, but I find this a really interesting sort of thing to think about. Like, to whose benefit is it, and what are the different or distinct sort of benefits for which one would want to have a federation? Now, let me get to their other sort of notes, but, you know, for sake of time, let me get to my question. So, and it goes sort of a little bit, I think it's maybe like the counterpoint to Sebastian's question. Aren't we shortchanging and downplaying the continued importance and relevance of federationalist units after decolonization? Sure, They weren't federations in the political sense of the term. That's very true. But in all sorts of different regions of the third world and in Europe at the same point in time, right? All sorts of different, you know, multi-state groups that had sometimes currency in common, sometimes they shared a common interest in a particular market, you know, did play a certain role. Aren't we, you know, somehow throwing the baby out with the bathwater here and say, yes, okay, well, in the end, it was the nation state that won out. That's very true. Yes, politically speaking, legally speaking, in international law, but in all sorts of other ways, however weak, federations, and perhaps we could think also about non-regionally based federations. Can we think about OPEC as a federation, for instance? Does it make sense to think about the things together? Might be something to continue to consider. That would be my question.
Thank you, Zers. Pass it on straight to Bernard, who had his hand raised, and then.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess I'm going to be stubborn here. I want you to answer Michael's question about whether there really it makes sense to talk about, to distinguish anti-colonialism from nationalism. That is to say that you can talk about that there are significant forms of anti-colonialism which aren't anti-colonial nationalism. Because as I think Michael said, it ended up most of what you all said, which may be your final opinion, is anti-colonial nationalism is much more complex, much more variegated, and we're constantly learning new ways in which it plays out. But I got really smart people who know a lot. So I'd like to know what the, you know, what the answer to the question is. Are there significant forms of anti-colonialism that don't take nationalistic forms, like Michael suggested with regard to the movements that Anderson calls Creole nationalists? Now, you have to do some fancy footwork to turn the Creole nationalists into nationalists. Those independent movements. I can do some of that fancy footwork, but I don't know enough to know whether it's legitimate. So I guess I'd like a more straightforward answer to Michael's question.
All right, I have a lot more questions here, so I'll give you the floor, and you pick whatever you
can't
you
expect a straightforward answer from Proteus. That's the very nature of I would follow Chimil's tactic from the first session and respond to both all three of these questions, and also, in fact, in part, to some things that Fred said, by talking about the very concrete case of the West Indies. Now, people like to flirt with the idea, of course, there was a West Indies Federation, and Federation of the West Indies was a political goal. But let's actually look at in detail at this phenomenon. Political actors in the West Indies in the 1930s and 40s had at the same time a variety of intersecting political commitments. They were Pan-Africans. They understood themselves as being part of a kind of global experience of Africa and its diasporas. Many of them were communists or people of the left, and imagined themselves as part of an international community that was going to be building a world based on the satisfaction of human need. At the same time, they understood themselves as Caribbean people and had would certainly come together in conferences and talk about a future West Indian nation. But at the same time, they were also profoundly Jamaican. So if you look, for example, at something like the People's National Party, which is the most important federalist engine within the Jamaican polity, they are concerned with Jamaican state-making and with working within the colonial state, as Sebastian has suggested, in terms of the politics of the possible. So that the distinction between the politics of nationalism as the history of politics and the politics of nationalism as the history of the state is quite clearly manifest in this context in which they are involved in contesting the nature of the colonial state in their own ethno-territorial space. And so that, you know, they were simultaneously offering these options. And the idea that somehow that federalism represented a commitment which was antagonistic to nation-making, this makes absolutely no sense in this context. And that what somebody like Richard Hart was doing at the Caribbean Labour Congress meeting of 1945, where he proposes that a West Indian Federation should be independent as a wholly independent dominion, did that mean that he wanted to remain under the British Crown? No. At this stage, he was essentially the British Communist Party's representative in the Caribbean. His vision was, in fact, of a socialist revolution of the Caribbean as part of a global thing. The point of the goal of dominion status was this represented within the landscape of existing politics a realistic and viable option. Now, at the same time, there were forms of, Bernard wants to know about forms of anti-colonial politics that were not nationalist. There were people who were imagining some future Pan-African moment of redemption, which would involve cultural change and civilizational change, which would not require the capture of a particular state apparatus. And these two things were not separate. They were flowing one into another. So I think we have to begin to think in terms of the complexity of objectives and the interpenetrations of forms of political and state-making goals which are being imagined both in the very local, granular terrain of the contemporary state and in terms of projects of possible future state arrangements.
Lydia?
So Sebastian's question on maybe we should be explicitly separating sort of aspiration from what historically happened. I mean, here I think it's quite interesting because they're clearly related, but they're not related directly. You don't aspire to something and get it, but the movements towards things I believe shape the horizon of political possibility. But sometimes that doesn't necessarily lead to not sometimes, often, it doesn't actually lead to the aspired goal. So, I mean, and this is, I think it really gets at this sort of point that can the nationalist claim ever be fully satiated? Getting back to that question, because I don't think it can. I don't think it can. I think you end up with. I think in a utopia it could, because everybody who lived within a particular nation state would feel adequately enfranchised and represented, but no one lives in that place. And therefore, you end up with claims within those states that may or may not be outright articulating a nationalist platform, but will be sort of based around the elements that could combine to that. So I think aspiration matters, but not in that people get what they're asking for, but rather that they don't. And on sort of weak versus strong, are it powerful elites or those who consider themselves disenfranchised who are really pushing for federation? I mean, Cyrus, I think you answered it yourself. It's both. But in what terms? I mean, I don't literally study actual federations. I look at calls for federation, and sometimes they're like threats. Lumumba, threatens the UN with an Articles of Confederation for, Congo, because you all know how well that worked out. Basically a federated Congo would disintegrate like the US Articles of Confederation. So it's often through these kinds of analogies. And we can call these aspirations, we can call these ideas, but they're ways of articulating sort of the political at a moment when there's all these seeming possibilities. And that's what's so exciting, is all these seeming possibilities and yet. And it's that and yet that I really grapple with, because there are so many structures, so many boundaries, so many borders that end up sort of shutting down those possibilities. But many of those possibilities aren't necessarily liberatory. I mean, I think that, I mean, getting back to Michael's question, yes, I think there are forms of anti-colonialism that are not nationalist. I mean, Richard, you articulated that. But I also think, and this isn't necessarily the group where one has to make this call, because not everyone here works on decolonization, but there are also forms of nationalism that are not anti-colonial, even in the political moment when seemingly that is how one should frame a claim against empire. I mean, yesterday we talked about white nationalism in Southern Africa. So I'll close there, but these are really sort of, I think, important questions to get us to sort of concretize these sort of lovely airy ideas. And yet, when you're talking about aspiration, you're also wanting to give those ideas their due, especially when they didn't lead to the kinds of structures that would, say, create a national archive, that would create a pantheon of founding figures, that would create the legacies of which you can then study that nationalist movement because it became an independent state.
Thank you. Fred?
You're muted.
Well, it seems like all three of them, Michael's question about anti-colonialism that isn't nationalist is yes. But that only gives rise to another set of questions, which I think Richard pointed to quite correctly. What are the articulations of claims to some kind of entity defined by national belonging to other sorts of claims, and that's a question that is extremely complex. The other, and ultimately requires a lot of attentiveness to the particular pathways through historical change that can lead to people ending up with the kind of structures that nobody actually, or very few people actually wanted at the beginning. It seems to me that the questions that Sebastian Serres raised are very closely related, but I think they could be posed slightly differently. To begin with the premise that we all know that we end up with the nation state. Yes and no, because we still come back to the point that Nicole was making yesterday, that in Southeast Asia, the states that we end up aren't all that much nation states. There's something more complex than that, with more than a small element of the imperial about them. So the nation state is a tremendously important fiction, but it remains in the large majority of the 200 so that we think exist. It remains a fiction, and the relationship between state and nation is in fact not only varied but highly contested. In another sense, the question of whether the forms of layered sovereignty are still in play is still an open one, because it is perfectly correct that ever since the era when national independence seemed to be triumphant, there have been attempts to form organizations that cross national lines, and not just at the kind of UN level that's global, but within regional configurations and so on. And these remain important possibilities. ECOWAS, the Economic Commission for West African states, is an interesting case in point. However, the vested interests that are acquired by national rulers once they come to power remains a really important factor. And while the Kwame Nkrumah wanted to immediately, upon Ghana becoming independent, pose the possibility of creating the United States of Africa, and was willing to say quite explicitly that he was willing to give up some of Ghana's hard-won sovereignty in order to do so, he found few, if any, takers of that line of argument, and instead the Organization of African Unity resolved in one of its first acts to enshrine the borders that the colonial states had bequeathed to their successors as an almost sacred category of politics. And very quickly, the Organization of Anti-Unity, of African Unity, became a kind of mutual protection society for African heads of state. And sovereignty became a much more entrenched and something that was used, that sovereignty was then used against the kinds of playmaking that early on had been at the core of anti-colonial politics, including politics that was specifically seeing that a nationalist cause would give rise to more voice for workers and farmers, etc. So but the point that I think is most important to derive from Sebastian's intervention is that we really need explanation. We don't have it. If we assume that the outcome that we have of going from a world of less than 50 states to a world of nearly 200 states means the triumph of the nation state. If we assume that this is an inevitable and natural cause of events, that what is what must have been, then we won't ask the question. I think the question remains one of extreme importance. And the line in which I think we can start to think about has very much been what all three of us have been talking about today, that a variety of demands get posed politically, some of which are plausible, some of which can be fulfilled, and some of which can get pushed out of the system. And it is clear that in the Western colonial empires, there are certain outcomes that they resisted tooth and nail. One would have been a communist or even a socialist takeover on a global scale, and federation in some cases would be opposed by the imperial powers, and corporate capitalism was not willing to defend colonial rule tooth and nail, and calculated quite correctly that it could adapt to the multiplication of states, but didn't want to face any kind of unity that would threaten the capitalist system as a whole. And some of this played out. So I think this plays out on a global scale. What is possible to protect may be a part of the goal. Part of the goal is autonomy from colonial domination. That part becomes an attainable goal. Others are faced with tooth and nail opposition. And within France until very late in the game, 1959 or 1960, kept thinking that one kind of post-imperial scheme or another would allow it to preserve itself as other than a small nation state on the western fringes of Eurasia. And there was the French Union, there was the French community. Ultimately, the France was not willing to pay the price that it would take in order to do so. That is paying for the social and economic equality of its former colonies, nor was it willing to give up its plans for creating a European Economic Community in order to include its former colonies that had been an integral part of France, so they said, in some kind of larger, what would have been a Euro-African economic community. France was willing to give up that goal in order to get what it wanted. So it seems to me that we do need to think, this is just this is a sketch of an explanation, not an explanation, but I think the text is to explain what seemed, such a large portion of people in fighting colonialism was not their primary goal, how that ended up as what they could get by the 1960s.
All right, thank you, Fred. So I have 2 more questions in the room and 3 more here on my screen. I'll throw them all of them at you and ask you to pick whichever you see fit. And as they say here, we probably need executive summaries by now, so try to be succinct. Let's start with Alex, Glenda.
So just a quick comment. In some ways, sorry to pile on, Sebastian, but again, this notion that what we ultimately ended up with was the nation state strikes me as demonstrably false. I mean, how many post-colonial nation states have been beset by separatist movements, collapse, civil war? I mean, if this was the ultimate prize, the nation state, it's proved to be exceedingly fragile and provisional, I would say. So that's a bit of what Fred and Lydia both were saying as well. This is not something that has worked out so well, which suggests, again, if you're looking for an explanatory model, it's how these other sources of affinity, anti-colonial sentiment or whatever might still be buried under the surface and keep erupting, even in the most stable places like South Africa, for example. And again, it is important to recognize that the white nationalism in Southern Africa was in fact constituted as an anti-colonial nationalism, right? I mean, this was one fragile bridge that the ANC and African nationalism was able to build to Afrikaners. Mandela was quite explicit about this, that we're both anti-colonial, and so posing themselves as opposition to the British Empire. So it cuts both ways, I suppose.
Thank you. So as the mic moves over to Glenda, I'll save time by reading one of these questions here from online by Aminata Buganzi Kinana, who asks, how have hybrid identities that are found everywhere affected the linear bias of nationalism, or rather nationalist narratives, with a particular eye to Africa and the African diaspora? Glenda.
Okay, thanks. I think probably this is a question for Lydia, and it goes back to yesterday's panel on nationalism and internationalism. I mean, I'm really struck by Ralph Bunche as someone who represents some of the contradictions of the international order, and because in the 60s he might be talking about the Congo and the fear of breaking up, but in the 40s he's bringing the UA people to the UN, and I know you know all this, because he's really worried about the ways in which these false imperial boundaries are breaking up communities, etc. And a figure like him as a Marxist sitting there, presiding over trusteeship. I just want your honest opinion about how you see the role of the international order, if you like, and of the UN or even the League, without mandates, without trusteeship. Would there have been the same kind of momentum around the nation as the objective of decolonisation, do you think? Or do you have some other way of thinking about the role of these institutions in the context of your very broad knowledge of the unrepresented, but also the represented?
All right, and I read two more to you from the online audience. One by Danielle Keepsgard, who asks, what insights does the discussion have for understanding nationalisms in Ethiopia, which did not experience decolonization as such, and whose particular federal model seems to have failed given the crisis in Tigray? And then, as we have another 3 official minutes, here comes the largest question from Margot Tudor, who says, great panel, I'm interested in thinking about the forces and people that constrained the world making plans that you've all mentioned. Why do you think that sovereignty won out, in quotation marks, in the debate of alternative world visions? Why did alternative anti-colonial nationalists confine themselves to nationhood when such vibrant alternatives existed, along with potential allies or collaborators? All right, we can move in 5 minutes or something into the break, but please, brief answers, make your pick which you think is most important. Let's start with Lydia, maybe.
For Lydia, so
let's start with Lydia, yeah.
Thank you so much, Glenda. That's a really great set of questions, and it's one I want to think further with. Ralph Bunche he's practically decolonization man, sort of capturing, as you mentioned, these complexities of, but he's not alone. I also think of Edouard Mondlane and working for the UN Trusteeship Council and before leading the Mozambican nationalist movement, Frelimo. So there's so many people who are wearing multiple hats, sort of moving back and forth between kind of imperial spaces and anti-colonial spaces, that you start to sort of problematize those labels and sort of what we even mean by kind of liberatory politics. And here, time matters quite a lot. Sort of what's possible in the late 40s versus what's possible in the early 50s, the late 50s, the early 60s. I mean, things change sort of year by year, month by month. And people are well aware of this, about this like pressure of time, particularly at the United Nations. They see, and I'm sort of paraphrasing from Connor Cruz O'Brien right here, that there was this kind of limited window to act in the late 50s, early 60s, and they had to get it right. And then many of them then felt that they didn't get it right, but that there was this sort of almost acceleration. And it's really kind of interesting to sort of unpack what changes and how those changes happen like so rapidly. Without mandates, I mean, mandates matter quite a lot. I mean, obviously, Susan Peterson kind of changed a lot of our perspectives on the importance of the League of Nations Mandate Commission. I mean, I don't believe that Namibia would be independent without the mandate of Southwest Africa. I believe that instead the territory would have been internationally legally incorporated into South Africa, and that at the end of apartheid, it would all be part of the same state. And Namibian nationalists were well aware of this quite early on in the early 60s. And that the importance of the mandate was not about how life was like in Southwest Africa and Namibia. What was important was that it provided this kind of international legal container that changed life for no one on the ground, but completely changed the future possibilities. And many places would have loved to have been in League of Nations mandate to have that kind of international legal container, even though it did not lead to sort of material change on the ground. And this, I think, connects to sort of aspiration versus material and the role of institutions of international order in framing that. In my own work with the United Nations, I differentiate between the UN as a system of international order and the UN as a set of bureaucracies. Obviously, this is not, there's overlap between those two sort of sets of entities. But when independence happens post-45, you have the UN representative arriving at the national independence set of ceremonies, and independence is sealed with membership in the UN General Assembly. And I think so many countries left, sorry.
We have to wrap this up.
Sorry, very quickly. So many countries left the League of Nations, or not so many, but some very important ones did. No one's left the United Nations. And that's because I think they perceive that it shores up their sovereignty rather than takes it away. And this is part of a much longer set of conversations. Thank you all so much. Just on Ethiopia, Safia Adid is doing absolutely wonderful work on Ethiopia in almost sort of as an imperial formation, and I recommend it. Thank you.
All right, let's reverse the order. Have Fred, and then.
Okay, on hybrid identities and nationalism, I think it's a very good question. I think that you're dealing with people both looking inward toward narrower focuses of identification than the kinds of nations that the international system recognized, and you're looking outward towards more complex forms and border crossing forms of affinity. Both Christianity and Islam, for example, represent important kinds of ways in which people are brought together with very consequences. On the role of the UN, etc. I agree with Lydia that it's really like central to the pattern that happened, and that's a subset of the question that the world powers coming out of with their imperial orientation did go a long way towards creating structures into the newer entrants had to see themselves placed, and it became very attractive. A seat in the UN, and maybe even more so, bodies like the ILO or the World Health Organization that had real resources to distribute. It became quite important to have sovereignty in order to make a direct appeal to those kinds of agencies. But it seems to me that the UN both opened up new possibilities, which we saw in the drive for recognition of a development decade of UNCTAD and then of the new international economic order, that there were possibilities of changing the whole structure. This is what Adam Getticher's book is largely about. But the existence of the UN and so on also had a very conservative dimension to it, and that ratified existing sovereignties. And that seems to me to be important in regard to Margaret Tudor's last question about sovereignty winning out. I think part of the answer is structural, both institutional, like the UN, probably even more so on the nature of the capitalist and competing communist systems in the 1950s and 1960s, about determining what various demands could be met and what would be combated. But the other point is that a little sovereignty goes a long way. And arguments have been made for decades about the weakness of the African state. And in some ways, the economic and social weakness of the African state is also why it's so tenacious. That sovereignty is what leaders latched onto, what they defended tooth and nail. And so a little sovereignty turns into a lot of sovereignty precisely because of its fragility within an unequal and exploitative international order. So the task ahead of us seems to me to conjugate studies that focus on the particular, on quests for realizing dignity and aspirations for collective goods on whatever basis people see themselves as belonging, with these kinds of overarching structures shaped by centuries of historical patterns, of which empire building is an extremely important part, and it's bringing these together that seem to me the tasks of answering the very good questions that have been asked in this last half hour.
All right, thank you, Fred.
Given the last word, I want to conclude by saying that many people who were nationalists in the 20th century were quite independently statists. And what do I mean by that? The state in the 20th century had a heroic history. The state in the early 20th century was connected to things like the 5-year plan in the Bolshevik system, the creation of the social state, the welfare states in Western Europe, the Keynesian developmental model. States meant having access to building your hydroelectric dams, it meant electrification, it meant public health, it meant public education, and that if you want to ask the question, why was the state the realistic exit from this political constraint? It had to do with the power of the state to engineer social progress. And, you know, we have all of these negative narratives about the state which have proliferated in the neoliberal moment. But let us be quite clear about how the state dramatically transformed living standards in the former colonial world. In the island of Barbados, in which I came from, infant mortality in 1918 was 300 for every 1,000 live births. Circa 1945, we were still at 200. The moment that universal suffrage is acquired and that statism is controlled by democratic actors, every 5 years, infant mortality divides by 2. You have a population which now had a higher life expectancy than Americans at some point by the late 20th century. And if you're comparing like for like, poor black people, the best place in the world to live. Created through the state and command over the state. Look at Libya. In 1969-70, life expectancy in Nigeria and in Libya was about the same, about 50. Under Gaddafi's regime, a state was created in Libya which generated life expectancies in the 70s by the time it was destroyed in 2011. The state is a powerful engine for engineering social good. Let us never forget that.
All right, thank you, Richard. Given the last word, ending with a passionate plea. So we have another coffee break now, and then the final session on the economy, which follows on from this. All right, thank you. Thanks also to Fred for joining us from New York, for getting up so early.